Hey, it's Pastor Dudley Rutherford with Godly Goosebumps. Thank you for tuning in today. We hope you're following us on Facebook, Instagram, and of course, you can always watch on YouTube. But this podcast, Godly Goosebumps. Oh, I love that name. We're just trying to tell some stories. I think most of you have never heard of these stories, but these stories are stories that cause you to look to God and to realize that He is still in control and that He has a plan. And that plan goes beyond our imagination. And hopefully, besides getting some goosebumps, when you reach this point where you realize within that God is real and that God is sovereign. Stories that only are possible because of His hand of blessing. I think of Jeremiah 29, verse 11, that says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." If you're listening today for the first time or you're a long-time listener, you need to know that God has a plan for you. You're not here by accident. Life is not just happenstance, but God is interweaving in our lives for a reason and for a purpose. You know, I have my dad recently, every year when Father's Day comes around, I think of my dad who passed several years ago. But he was a great man, and my dad was a minister of a very large church, at one time the largest church in the state of Kansas. And he had two brothers. And those two brothers also preached at very, very large churches. And then today, I happen to live in the great state of California in the beautiful city called Los Angeles, really at one of the largest churches in the country. And all of that, is because of the blessing of God. But I want to go back and tell a story that means a lot to me and perhaps to you, in the fact that I'm not sure any of us would be here had it not been for this story that I'm about to tell. The only memory that I have of my paternal grandfather was when my father took me to a hospital one snowy night to visit him before he died. My grandfather died, I was 4 years old. It's the only time I remember meeting him in my mind. I've heard lots of stories. I've read lots of different articles concerning him, and I've talked to a lot of people who knew him, but the only time I remember meeting my grandfather was when I was 4 years old. Again, a snowy night. My dad snuck us into the hospital to see him before he died. Never got the chance to know him, but I did get to know my grandmother, my grandfather who died. I got to know his wife. Again, my grandmother, her name is Millie. Millie used to tell me all kinds of stories about my grandfather. I could sit and listen to her stories for hours. But there was one story above all the stories that I could never hear enough times. And it goes like this. When my grandmother met my grandfather, he was a lawyer working for the United States government. He was working at Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the county courthouse, I believe. And they met, they fell in love, and he did what every respectable young man in that day would do. He took her home to meet his mother. This would be my great-grandmother. And he told my grandfather, his name was Jim, and Jim told Millie, that was my grandmother, he said, "Millie, I'm taking you home to introduce you to my mom. And as soon as we walk into the house, she's going to say something to you. And I'm just kind of warning you before we walk into the house. I want you to know what my mother's going to say to you." And he said, "She's going to say to you, Millie, nice to meet you. Did you know that Jimmy's going to be a preacher one day?" I want to say that again. She's going to say, "Millie, nice to meet you. Do you know that Jimmy's going to be a preacher one day?" After my grandmother recovered from the initial shock, after all, lawyers are not often compelled to become preachers, my grandfather began to explain how, as a little boy, he had become deathly ill. This was back before the days of modern medicine, so when a child got sick, it could be a very hopeless situation. Well, he got sick and he was in a hopeless situation. And his mother prayed, God, if you take my little boy, I will understand. But if you would somehow heal little Jimmy, he will grow up and I will raise him to be a great preacher and a great man of God. Well, God answered her prayers. My grandfather began to get better instantly as a child, and within a few days he was completely healed, running around the house as though nothing had ever happened to him, as though he'd never been sick. But staying true to her promise, his mother soon began to introduce her boy by saying, this is my son Jimmy. He's going to be a preacher one day. It didn't make any difference whom he was being introduced to. My grandfather's mother would always say the same thing over and over again. Nice to meet you. Did you know that Jimmy's going to be a preacher one day? Well, during his elementary and junior high years, my grandfather was afraid to bring anyone home from school because he knew what his mom would announce right as his guest walked through the door. He was embarrassed by it. He actually decided that he would never, ever become a preacher. He was so embarrassed by that thought. But now he's in his 30s. He's a lawyer. He's working for the United States government, Tulsa County Courthouse. And he meets my grandmother, Millie, brings her home. And it's going to be the same thing. It's the same scenario. Nothing has changed. The greeting was going to be what it had been for the last 25 years. My grandmother told me that when they walked through that door, just like clockwork, the first word she heard was the grandmother saying, "Hi, Millie, nice to meet you. Did you know that Jimmy's going to be a preacher one day?" After they were married, my grandfather and grandmother attended a very small church that probably had no more than about 30 people on the very best of Sundays. And one day, that pastor of that little tiny church that they were attending, he left suddenly, and they were without a preacher. And the elders came to my grandfather and asked him if he would be interested in doing some of the preaching. After all, he was a lawyer. He was used to standing up in front of people. But again, he had determined he would never be a preacher. And yet, the elders came to him and said, "Hey, we've lost our preacher. Would you be willing to preach for us?" And of course, his response was, "Hey, I'm in the law business. I know nothing, absolutely nothing about preaching." But my grandmother, Millie, she had another reaction. She said, "Now, James, let's pray about this." And then they told the elders, "Give us 2 weeks to pray, and we will let you know." I can only imagine the reaction of my grandfather at that moment. After what I'm sure seemed like the longest 2 weeks of his life, my grandfather went to the elders, and here's what he said. He said, "Gentlemen, I will fill the pulpit. I will preach for 2 weeks, but don't ever ask me again." Do you understand this? He said, I'll preach for 2 weeks, but don't ever ask me again. And so he preached the next 2 weeks, and then he preached the next week, and then he preached the following week, and then he preached the week after that. And by the time it was all said and done, my grandfather was a pastor of that church for almost 30 years. He built one of the largest Christian churches in the state of Oklahoma at that time. This was back in the days of the Depression. And even though he became a great soul winner for his generation, his greatest legacy is found in his 3 children, who all became preachers, one of which was my father. My father preached close to 70 years. My dad had 5 children. Both of my brothers are ministers. Both of my sisters married ministers. And here I am, a grandson, a 3rd-generation preacher. And I have 3 children, all of whom are serving the Lord today. And it all goes back, I believe, to the faithful prayers of one woman, a great-grandmother that I never met, but whose prayers changed 4 generations. And I tell that story to tell you that prayer matters. Prayer works. Prayer changes lives. Prayer can have an effect for many generations. So the next time you're with one of your children or one of your grandchildren or a friend, classmate, teammate, begin to pray, because prayer is powerful. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5:17 tells us to pray continually. We learn from the book of James that, again, the prayer of a righteous man can accomplish much. And I just want to encourage you to become a person of prayer. You never know the result of one child, one person being healed, being saved, being redeemed, and what the consequences are of that person's life being changed. So I hope this story was a blessing to you. I think of all the preachers, all the churches, all the lives that were changed and saved and healed, all goes back to just my great-grandmother praying for her little boy that he'd get healed, and for the rest of her life believing that God would answer her prayers as he answered the prayers that day. God bless you for listening to Godly Goosebumps today. Give us a follow on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Hit that share button. God bless you, and we'll see you here next week.